Hello everyone, and welcome to the Peace Before Christmas. My name's Chris, and I don't know about you, but I'm rather excited about Christmas Day tomorrow. In fact, the more I think about it, the less I feel like sleeping. I think I need to spend a little time calming myself down so that tomorrow will get here sooner. And I'd love for you to join me for a little while too. Just time for me to make sure I've got everything ready before we do that though. Let's see. Got the carrot here, and I've already got the mince pie and glass of milk set out for Father Christmas. Check. Pillows, plumped and cuddly toys set and ready for bed. Check. One glass of hot chocolate. Check. Oh, and the materials for the craft. Check. And if you want to join in with the craft, then here's what you'll need. A small piece of card. You might want to reuse an old Christmas card. A pair of scissors. 2 types of glue, PVA and a glue stick. Some thread, a nice sparkly one if you can get hold of any, a pen, and depending on what you can get hold of, either some cocktail sticks or some coffee stirrers. Now I think that's all, but if you can think of anything else or you're not quite ready yet, then there's still a bit of time before we begin. And when you're ready, then we will begin. And because I want to give some time for the glue to set, I'm actually going to jump straight into the first part of the craft, so I really hope you are ready. So as I say, there's going to be a couple of different options for this depending on what sort of materials you've got available, but they both start out the same way. You're going to need a couple of circles of cardboard. Now you need something to draw around. I'm just going to use the top of my glue stick. That seems like it's perfectly reasonable. Now where's my pen? Ah, there it is. So I'm just going to draw around that. Ooh. And you need 2 circles. So I'm going to draw a second one. Just like that. Go all the way around. There we go. And then, if you didn't already guess, you're going to need to cut them out. Now, take your time with this, because scissors are sharp. And of course you have plenty more time than I do. I'm trying to do this under pressure. While still trying to talk to you at the same time. Don't worry if you're not too accurate though. Almost there, and done. Right, so those are my 2 circles. So what we'll be making with the sticks, well, as I say, it depends a little bit on what materials you've got. If you've got coffee stirrers, you quite easily need to just stick them together and make a sort of spokey thing, a little bit like this. And the easiest way to do that is just take 2 sticks and put them together and make a sort of cross shape, and it can take a little bit of time just to sort of find the middle. You make 2 of these and then stick them together and you get one of them. I think you can probably figure that bit out for yourself, can't you? This bit you want to use the PVA for though, because it's much better at sticking things together than, well, a glue stick. Oh, which reminds me, I need to put the lid back on the glue stick after I draw around it with the circles so that it doesn't dry out. If you're using cocktail sticks though, it's a little bit more complicated. Not too much more complicated though. I think you'll be able to manage. So you just need to, well, I'm going to go straight into the PVA. Just dip it in the end, run it around a bit. You don't want too much glue on there because otherwise it will take a very long time to dry. And then you just need to find the middle of the circle and stick it down. And then another one. Ooh, not too much on there. And, oh dear, I think I put too much on that one. Oh well. Again, you're probably going to want to do a sort of cross shape first. Hope you can all see what I'm doing here. make a cross shape first, and then do the other spokes afterwards. A bit like that. Might take a little bit of time fiddling around. And obviously be careful because, well, they do have spikes on the end. Try not to poke yourself too hard, well, or at all. Especially this time, this close to Christmas. You don't want to be injured because, I mean, you've got to use your fingers for unwrapping presents, haven't you? Right, I'm almost there now. And how are you coffee stirrer people getting on? I hope you're doing quite well too. Almost there, one more. Now, of course, PVA does take a little bit of time to dry. So, we are going to be putting it to one side. But once you're done with that, you just need to put a little bit of glue. Haven't really thought this through. A little bit of glue on the other one. Fortunately, there should be plenty of glue on the cocktail sticks already. And then glue the other side in place. Nice and easily, just like that. And then you'll end up with something that looks like that. And if you've got your coffee stirrer ones, well, then you're going to need a couple more circles, and you need to put one on that side and one on that side. And that, at this stage, is all there is to it. Now, as I say, PVA does take a little bit of time to dry. So, once it is done, put it to one side and don't be tempted to fiddle with it. I've made that mistake a couple of times and it's ended up unsticking and taking even now I'm trying to fiddle with it. Just put it down and leave it alone. And we'll get back to the craft a bit later on, once the glue's had a nice long time to dry. Now, one of the things I like to do is look at how they celebrate Christmas in other parts of the world. And recently I was curious to find out if there was anything interesting in Japan. And here's what I found out. Historically, Japan kept its doors closed to the rest of the world for a very long time. And as such, Christmas in Japan wasn't really celebrated that much for a long time too. That means it doesn't have many of the really long-term traditions that some countries do. Over the last 100 years or so, though, Christmas in Japan has grown steadily and based many of its ideas about Christmas on what they've seen in the rest of the world. Partly on what people moving to the country have brought with them, and significantly around movies and other media. As such, it's ended up being a season of joy, love, and just a little bit of magic, but it doesn't have many of the more religious elements. In the 1980s, when Disneyland Tokyo opened, it put on a Christmas-themed event in December, and it has done every year since. And that is a good example of the sort of Christmas experience many Japanese people will have. That's not to say, though, that Christmas in Japan doesn't have a very special flavour of its own. Over the decades, it's created its own uniquely Japanese versions of many elements. Now, Christmas in Japan is as much about the season as it is the day. It begins to appear shortly after Halloween ends, and it runs through most of November and December. And there are plenty of indicators that the day is on its way. Christmas songs start to get played on the radio, and some of them you might recognise, like Last Christmas and All I Want for Christmas Is You. And of course there's plenty of Japanese Christmas songs too. But one of the most popular songs you'll hear at this time of year will be Beethoven's Ninth, or just number 9, as it's often called in Japan. And it's especially the last part which you might know as Ode to Joy, and it's sung in German, and it's thought to have its roots in German prisoners of war from the First World War. And it's not just music either. Christmas trees will start to appear all across the country, decorated with baubles, tinsel, and lots of lights. Indeed, the illuminations go much further than that, and many of the main streets and buildings are lit up with lots of colour. And there are also children's parties held throughout this time too, with some Christmas cake and a good chance that you'll see Father Christmas, or Santa-san, as he's known out there. By the 26th of December though, the season comes to an abrupt end, as almost all the Christmas decorations come down, ready for the New Year's celebrations. In fact, though some children will be free from school as preparation for the New Year, the poor adults, well, the 25th of December is mostly just a normal work day. It used to be that there might be a public holiday for the Emperor's birthday, but that's changed since the new Emperor in 2019 too. That doesn't mean that Christmas Eve and Christmas Day don't have some meaning though. Christmas Eve is considered to be one of the most romantic days of the year. A little bit like Valentine's Day, I suppose. So you'll find lots of couples out and about on that evening, and good luck if you're trying to book a restaurant table and leave it too late. Many of the couples will take a romantic stroll through the towns and cities, looking at all the lights that have been put up, and perhaps visiting a German Christmas market. And of course, that means you may well be giving a present to your nearest and dearest. But most of the gift giving amongst family and friends is saved for the New Year, as it's had a far longer tradition of doing so in Japan than Christmas has. Indeed, in something of a reversal of how many of us celebrate the festive season, New Year's is actually considered to be a quieter time, when people come together as a family to celebrate, rather than just a really good excuse for a party. Now, as for the families on Christmas Eve, it tends to be slightly more like we celebrate Christmas, coming together for a meal, and there are a couple of very important traditions when it comes to the food. Firstly is the Christmas cake, or Karisamasu keki. And in Japan, it isn't a fruitcake, but rather a light sponge with strawberry and cream filling, with plenty of cream and even more strawberries on top. Now here's an interesting fact. If you've ever used the shortcake emoji, it's actually not supposed to be a shortcake at all, but rather a slice of Japanese Christmas cake. And the main meal isn't turkey, but rather chicken, though a very particular type of chicken. Kentucky Fried Chicken. Yes, that's right. In the 1970s, the manager of Japan's first KFC ran an advertising campaign of Kentucky for Christmas, and it was so popular that if you want to guarantee yours for Christmas these days, then you'll need to book about 6 weeks in advance and then potentially queue for hours to pick it up. And I complain if I have to wait 10 minutes for a KFC. Well, that's pretty much it for Christmas in Japan. In some ways, it's what happens if you watch every sloshy Christmas movie, listen to every terrible Christmas song, and then try and replicate it all. But in other ways, it's very much doing its own unique thing. And of course, we have our own unique ways of celebrating Christmas here. One of which involves the annual letter from Father Christmas. But before we get to this year's, I thought I'd reread the one that I received last year, just to remind ourselves what he was up to. Hello once more, Chris and friends. First of all, some good news. The North Pole Games went ahead this year, and competitors came from all the cold and magical places of the world to compete, with hopes and dreams of becoming champions. Some of the highlights were a photo finish in the reindeer race that saw Dasher just pipping Blitzen to the win, and naturally, Dancer won the dressage, though she was given a surprising run for her money by a Canadian moose. The luge, which is normally dominated by penguins, saw a plucky sea lion picking up third place to much applause, and Clive and Felicity took first place in the ice dancing with a performance that still brings a tear to the eye when I think about it. In the team competitions, the elves handily beat the goblins at most events, including the present wrapping, the curling, and the tree decorating. Somehow, the goblins did pick up a few wins in the track events, and I know they cheated, but I can't quite work out how. If you wonder why I can be so sure, though, it's because they cheat in every event they take part in. It's just that most of the time they get caught. Ember also competed this year, though his performance was not the greatest ever seen. A 6th place out of 8 in the snowball fight was his best performance, but he seemed happy enough with it. And it was his first games, so he'll probably do much better next time. The closing ceremony had a spectacular firework display, and after many goodbyes, everyone went back to the places they'd come from. But when all the other goblins had gone away, there was one that stayed in the stadium. It seemed that she didn't want to go back to the caves with all the others, and asked if maybe there was a possibility to be allowed into the workshop with the elves. So now is probably a good time to explain the nature of goblins. You see, many years ago, a group of elves became jealous that they made all these presents for other people, but never got to keep any themselves. They started stealing the toys and games and hiding them in caves. After a while, though, they became so bitter, twisted, and generally horrible that they began to physically change. Their skin turned green, they started to hunch over, and even their voices sounded meaner. Eventually, they refused to make any more toys, took a bunch of supplies, and made a permanent move to their caves, where they've lived ever since, occasionally being joined by others that feel the same. Fortunately, though, this process is not permanent and can work both ways. So after a little time of being in the workshop, this goblin began to change back into the lovable elf she once was. She started making toys once more and found she could stand up straighter. But her skin lost most of its green tone. By the end of the week, she was back to fully being the elf she used to be, though apparently it had been such a long time that she had been a goblin known only as Urg that she'd forgotten her original name. She's given up trying to remember it and is, instead, currently deciding on a new one. Suggestions are welcome, though not Ember 2, as someone came up with. Well, I hope you all have a good and peaceful Christmas, and hope to hear from you soon. Father Christmas. So, this year's letter is coming a little later on, but for the second place I wanted to look at for their Christmas traditions, I thought I'd take a look at somewhere that's been making the news a lot recently, and that's Ukraine. I wanted to find out what Christmas there looks like in more normal times, and before I start I must apologise for my attempts at pronouncing words if they don't go so well. Now, first things first is the date. So up until fairly recently, Christmas was exclusively celebrated on the 7th of January. And this is still mostly true for those living outside the major cities. But around 5 years ago, the Ukrainian government also made the 25th of December a public holiday for people to celebrate Christmas. So now, some people celebrate on the 7th of January. Others celebrate on the 25th of December, and some people use it as a really good excuse to do both. And there are also other important dates around the Christmas season too, including St. Catherine's Day, when women and girls try to divine their fates, especially their future husbands. St. Andrew's Day, that is a time for fun and games often involving a ring-shaped bread called kalita. And St. Nicholas's Day, when adults traditionally brew beer while children write their letters to St. Nicholas. Good children may well find a present under their pillow, while less good children may well find a stick. And indeed, this is the time of year when children will receive their presents, rather than on Christmas Day, as you might have expected. That time is more focused on being together and eating. Now, the Christmas season in Ukraine has two main themes to it. Partly, it's a celebration of the religious elements, and partly, it's a celebration of the harvest with the hopes of a good year to come. So, alongside decorations you might be familiar with, like Christmas trees, one of the most important decorations you'll see in any Ukrainian home is called the Diduk, which translates roughly as ancestor spirit. It's a large decorative sheaf of rye, and you might also find smaller ornaments made out of straw and grass, things like animals, and you'll probably also see lots of paper stars or lanterns used especially during a nativity march or during caroling. And speaking of which, caroling, especially on Christmas Eve, is an important tradition. It usually starts with children visiting their neighbours and friends, singing a song and being given sweets or maybe a little money. These carols are known as koladka. But a week later, on New Year's Eve, there's a second set of songs called Shedrivka, or the generous carols, and these ones have a bigger emphasis on the harvest and the springtime to come. Now, probably the most famous Shedrivka is called Shedrik. It's a song about a swallow coming into a house and telling the residents of the springtime that's already on its way. It was composed in 1916 and became famous in 1922, 100 years ago, when it was performed around the world, particularly in America. A very different version with English lyrics, but the same tune, was then released in the 1930s, and we know it today as the Carol of the Bells. But don't worry if you don't recognise that name. I'll play it a bit later on and the tune may well ring a bell. Now, New Year's is also the time to do something that I must say doesn't look appealing to me at all. An area of frozen ice is opened up in a lake or river, and people take a very short swim in it. But those who take it very seriously insist you must duck your head underwater at least 3 times, or it doesn't count. But back to Christmas. When the Christmas Eve caroling is done, it's time to think about the food, which isn't traditionally allowed until the first star is in the sky. But it's probably worth it, because there's 12 dishes to the meal. None of these dishes traditionally contain meat or milk, as it's still the last day of fasting, and the dishes will vary from home to home, from simple things like cabbage, potatoes, mushrooms, porridge, to more elaborate things like borscht, dumplings, pincher cake, verhunny pastries, and something called herring under a furry coat, which apparently involves pickled herring covered in grated boiled eggs, vegetables, onions, and mayonnaise. But the most important food at any table is called kutya. Indeed, it's almost sacred and only served at Christmas. It's a wheat grain-based dish, or sometimes rice or pearl barley, and it can have nuts, raisins, poppy seeds, and importantly honey in it. But it depends on the family recipe. It symbolises the cycle of planting, growing, and harvesting, and by eating it, people will become a part of this cycle, with the honey looking forward to the sweetness to come. This dish is not just served at one meal though. Often children are sent to take it to relatives or godparents, and often they're rewarded for doing so with a little gift. Christmas Day itself often involves a trip to the church, but bear in mind there's not normally any seats in the churches, so there's quite a lot of standing about and tired legs by the end of it. Then it's back home to prepare yet more food, which, as the fast has now ended, will likely include some meat as a celebration. Often, the whole extended family will be gathered in the same place to cook, eat, and sing together. And that's mostly Christmas in Ukraine. Though there is one creature I didn't mention that gets a look in at Christmas that you may not expect. An eight-legged friend, the spider. And this comes from an old story that, well, it varies a bit depending on who you ask, but at its heart there's a widow and some children with a Christmas tree but can't afford to decorate it. So a spider makes a web that covers overnight, and in the morning the web has turned to silver and gold. It's also from this story that it's thought we get tinsel. So with that said, you might now have worked out what that first part of the craft was about. We're going to be making spiderweb decorations to put on our trees. So, let's get to it. Right, so hopefully by now your glue will have dried. Seems pretty good for me. So the first thing you're going to want to do might sound a little unusual. Remember I said you also need a glue stick? Well, first thing you're going to need to do is just put a bit of glue down each of the spokes. And if you're doing the cocktail stick version, you just need to do the front. I'm actually going to show you with the coffee stirrer version though. And in this case, you want to go along the edge of each of the spokes. This might seem a little bit unusual, but we're going to be adding some thread on there. And what I found is that if you just do it straight onto the sticks, well, the wood's a bit slippery, you see. And so I found the thread kept slipping up and down, and it became a very fiddly indeed, and not a little bit annoying. So, once you've done that, it's a little bit gluey, so just be careful when you're touching it, and indeed anything else. I'm just going to put that down and hope I don't glue it to the seat. Now you're going to need to take your thread, and to start it off, you're going to need to make a circle, and you can go around your finger for this, and then pull it through. Oh dear, not going very well. But don't pull it tight yet. So you're kind of making a knot. Right, got it. And then once you've got that knot, you need to slide the loop onto one of your spokes and pull it tight. And then, oh, where's that gone? You can either chop off the excess, or you can just tuck it under the circle. And what you'll find is that as the glue dries, it will keep it all in place. Now you want to tuck this one quite close to the centre circle. And then from here it's actually relatively easy. So you just go onto the next spoke, wind it round, and then onto the next one. And wind it round, and then onto the next one, and wind it round. And as you're going along, you just want to make sure you're going a little tiny bit, and I really do mean a little tiny bit, only like a millimetre or something, further out with each one. Oh dear, that one slipped a bit. As I say, can be a bit fiddly, but with some practice, it's relatively okay. There we go, and that's now almost, that's one full rotation. And so you see I've stepped it out a little bit more. I hope you're able to see it. I did pick some nice sparkling thread. And basically, that is all there is to it. You just need to keep going round and round, getting a little bit further out each time. I hope it's all working out for you quite nicely. Now, I'm going to keep going with this, but I said earlier that there was a Ukrainian song that we might have heard the English version of called Carol of the Bells. I'm actually now going to play the original Ukrainian version of that song and see if you recognize it. So hopefully that should be starting about now. So, there we go. Do you recognise it? As I say, it gets played quite a lot around this time of year. And though you may not recognise any of the words, you'll know what the tune is for the future. And you'll have something to impress your friends at school with, I hope. Now, I'm almost there with my spider web. What about you? I say, once you get into a rhythm, it's actually not too difficult. Well, I say that, but if there are some bigger people that are struggling, well, try not to show them up too much. And once you're getting a bit close to the edge and you don't think you can get any more, the last one, I just put it right into the other one next to it. I just wrap it around a few times, and then again, this bit might be a little bit tricky, but try and, oh, I need to snip the end off first. Try and create a knot. Now, if you're sensible, and not me, then you will leave enough thread to be able to tie a nice knot. And if not, then not. That doesn't make any sense. But do not. But, you know, do not. Just do a knot. There we go. Sorry, that was very fiddly of me. And it was all entirely my own fault for pulling it too tight. There we go. And then just another knot like that. And then I'm going to snip off the excess. There we have a nice little spider's cobweb. Oh, but of course, we're forgetting something. We need a spider at the centre of it. Now, where has my pen gone? Ah, there it is. So, the best way I found for doing a spider is kind of two black blobs. So, one like that, and then a slightly smaller one above it. And then if you're feeling particularly creative, you can even give him a couple of little fangs. And then you need to get some legs. So, go 1, 2, 3, 4. And a 1, a 2, a 3, and a 4. And the bottom ones, I then also do a little bit down like that, a little bit down like that. And then those ones at that angle, and that one 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 at that angle. And we have a spider. Well, my attempt at a spider anyway. And as I say, that's what the one using the coffee stirrer looks like. I think that looks quite good. Turned out quite well. And that one I've used gold thread on. And the one I had earlier, this is what happens when you use, well, this is sort of a grey thread. So it's not as sparkly. But what you can do is, if you're feeling really advanced, is add a bit of sparkles to it later. I'm not going to attempt glitter at this time of night, however, because I don't want to have to clear it up. So that's my advice too. So I hope your spider web turned out nicely, and don't be afraid to keep going for a little while. So if you need a bit more time, then feel free to keep going. And when it's done, I would put it to one side and advise waiting until morning for it all to dry before you hang it on your tree. For now though, it's a time I've been waiting eagerly for. It's this year's letter from Father Christmas. It's that time of year once more, Chris and friends. And what a mixed year it's been. I'll start with some good news. The former goblin I mentioned last year finally settled on a name, though getting to that stage took quite a while. So many elves and others were coming up with ideas that eventually they all got put into a hat and one was drawn out every day to be her name for that day, until one would seem right. We got through a lot of name tags, I can tell you, but eventually, just as people were complaining that it was taking too long and it was already June, well, that was the one that stuck. So June it is. Then there was just the matter of finding her role within the workshop. Clive tried to get her involved in the art department, but she didn't really find she had the flair for it. And there was a similar story when Felicity tried to get her involved in the elf engineering side of things. June finally settled on a role within the quality assurance department, making certain that all the toys and games we send out are of the highest standards. And incidentally, she's been very useful at keeping Ember busy too. Whenever a new design is sent down to her, after an initial inspection, she gives it to the little polar bear to test. If he can't find a way to break something else with it, or injure himself on it, then chances are no one else can either. Not that I'm encouraging you to try, you understand. Well, it was a few months into her new job that she came to me with a problem. It seemed that an unusually high number of toys weren't passing inspection, so I assured her I'd do some investigating to get to the root of the problem. It didn't take too long. It seems that with the cost of things going up so much this year, well, some of my accounting elves had switched us over to cheaper materials. Well, that resulted in seemingly endless meetings where I refused
refuse to compromise on the quality of the toys that we produce, and the accountant's telling me we needed to cut costs. Do you know they even suggested I should raise the level of how good children needed to be to receive a present? Well, we worked something else out in the end, but it does mean the warehouse is a little colder this year, and I'll need to make lots more public appearances this Christmas. I'm actually writing to you now while being on a whistle-stop tour of Canada. I just hope nothing goes too wrong while I'm away from the North Pole. But let's finish on some good news. Just a week ago, when everyone was starting to feel a little down, we were given news of the engagement of Clive and Felicity. The proposal itself was a simple affair, a lovely clear night with the northern lights shining bright and a shooting star overhead. The wedding preparations, however, that might not be so simple. I've already heard some of their plans and I have no idea how they're going to arrange it all. Well, I better get back to it. I can see Vancouver in the distance. Have a good Christmas all. Father Christmas. Well, sounds like it's exciting times at the North Pole this year. And it also sounds like it's been a bit chilly in the workshop. Talking of which, it's been a bit chilly around here this year too. I've put the fire on for now, but the heating hasn't been on quite as much as I'd like. Must say I feel the cold especially in the mornings. When I am nice and warm in bed, it feels even worse when I have to leave it. In fact, I must say I get rather jealous of animals that can hibernate. And while I have experimented with eating an extraordinary amount of food and sleeping for a really long time, well, I just keep waking up. And eventually, I get told I have to go to work. But actually, just because an animal can hibernate, it turns out they don't always. It can depend on a variety of factors, primarily how cold it gets. And this is true of a number of animals you might think always hibernate, like, well, foxes and squirrels. So if you do see one playing in the snow this winter, don't be too surprised. And actually, this year's story is about one of those animals, and it's called The Winter Thief. Just outside the edge of a town, and across a small patch of grass were some woods. And just inside these woods lived a squirrel named Sean. Now, at the time of the year we joined the story, Sean was very busy. It was autumn, and there were lots of nuts, seeds, and other things that needed collecting and burying ready for the long winter ahead. "Let's see," he said to himself. "Start at the beech tree, look up to see the branch that points the way, then 2 hops to the left and 3 bounds forwards, and I'll bury this acorn here." Then he took another nut from his stash. "Right, start at the elm tree with the knot on the side of the trunk. 2 leaps forward and 4 to the right. That should do nicely." And so it went on. He was quite practiced at this now, having spent one winter with his mum showing him what to do, and another by himself rather successfully. He had a very good memory, and only ever misplaced a little of his stash. "Start at the chestnut tree, 2 jumps forward, 1 to the left, then back 3 more." But just as he was about to bury this acorn, he noticed another squirrel watching him, so he dug a hole and pretended to put the nut inside while secretly hiding it in his mouth. Then he covered the hole over and jumped away to find a better hiding spot. That was one nut no one else was going to steal. About a month later, the nuts and berries on the trees began to run out, and soon there were none left to hide. Many of the trees had lost all their leaves too, but Sean felt quite happy about all the preparations he had made for the winter. Though he did feel a little peckish right now, so he decided it was time to dig something up. Down his tree he climbed, then across to the elm. "Find the knot on the side," he said to himself, "then 2 leaps forward and 4 to the right." He dug in the ground, and sure enough, there was the nut that he'd buried. He put it back in his mouth and scampered back to his nest for some breakfast. But later that day, something unexpected and rather unwelcome happened. As he was just trying to locate one of his stashes for lunch, there was a great noise of something approaching. He fled back to his nest in the treetop and looked down on what happened below. From beyond the edge of the woods, he saw some humans approaching with machines and tools. He was rather afraid, as he didn't often see humans this close, only when they wandered through the woods below. And though the small ones always seemed nice and made funny noises at him, these ones were much taller and did not seem friendly at all. And sure enough, after a little grunting to each other, they set to work and began to chop down one of the trees. And once they were done with it, they loaded it onto a truck before beginning on another. There was nothing Shaun could do except hope that his tree wouldn't be next. But after a few hours it was getting a little darker, and the humans left with what they had claimed. As Shaun looked out at what they'd taken, he realised that his tree was now at the edge of the woods. At least they've gone for now, he thought to himself, but what if they come back? He would have to be ready to move just in case, so decided to dig up as much of his stash as he could before it was too dark. He clambered down the tree and into the middle of what was now tree stumps. Let's see, find the beech tree. I think it was this one, but where is the branch to point the way? He searched around as best he could, but with no trees to act as landmarks, his memory was not much use, and he had to try and sniff out his stashes. Finally, it got too dark, and he only had a little food. It was enough for a few days, and if he scavenged more, he would probably be all right for a week or so, but it was a long time until spring would come. He ate his dinner slowly and carefully, not wanting to use too much, before settling down for sleep, still a little hungry. The next day, the humans didn't come back, which was a relief to Shaun, and indeed they never seemed to return. But though that was some good news, Shaun was slowly running out of food. He'd managed to find a few more of his stashes, especially the ones where the trees hadn't been chopped down and he had landmarks to work with. But the ground was hard with frost. There was even a light fall of snow too, and that made it even harder to sniff any out. He also tried to go deeper into the forest to scavenge, but other squirrels chased him off, protective of their own food that they'd stored. There were other foods that he could get, a little soft tree bark, the occasional mushroom or insect, and so on. But without the stash of nuts, he was in trouble. He needed a new plan, and in desperation, he knew what it was. He looked out from his nest across the green field to the human town just beyond. There was a fence he knew that he could easily climb. Then he hoped that they might have some food there that he could find. And so, the following morning, he did just that, dashing across the field and clambering up the fence. What he saw on the other side was a very strange thing indeed. The green areas were all divided up into sections by fences. A house was attached to each one. Humans really are strange creatures, he thought to himself, then set about the task of searching for some food. He rather quickly spotted something amazing. A whole tube of nuts and seeds just hanging from the branch of a tree. He wondered at first if this was some sort of trap and approached it cautiously. Climbing up the base of the tree and out onto the branch, it seemed safe enough, and he reached down and pulled out a seed. He was so hungry that he didn't think twice about scarfing it down straight away. And maybe it was because he was so hungry, but it tasted incredible. Then he reached out to get another and shoved it in his mouth, chomping it down. But he didn't want to get too carried away, so he stored a few in his cheeks for later. And this turned out to be a good decision, because all of a sudden he heard a door open behind him, and there was a large human standing in the doorway, shouting something. Sean dropped to the ground, landing in the snow before retreating back to the top of the fence. Sure enough, the human was looking at him and seemed angry about something. With one last glance, Sean disappeared back over the fence, across the grass, and back to his nest. He'd got enough food to last a couple of days, but he wondered if it was worth the risk of going back again. Well, hunger can drive a squirrel to desperate things, and so 2 days later he had little choice but to go back. He climbed the fence once more and observed the scene. He knew this time that he'd need to be more careful. So sneakily as he could, he approached the tree. He climbed up and positioned himself ready, then as quick as he could, grabbed as many seeds as possible. This time, the human didn't seem to have noticed him, so he took what he could and escaped back to the nest. Then, seeing as it had gone so well, he went back and did the same thing once more that day. Now this meant that Sean ate relatively well for the rest of the week, and when the food ran out, he felt fairly confident about going back for more. So again, he dashed across the grass, up the fence and over to the tree. But he went out onto the branch, he noticed something different about the tube of nuts, but couldn't work out what it was. Then he reached out to grab a nut, but realised it was too far away. He climbed out a little bit more, but still couldn't quite reach it. So he had to decide to try something different. He rocked back on his hind legs and jumped across to the tube, but found he couldn't get a grip and fell to the floor. He tried again, but still no luck. Then again and again. The one time he did manage to get a grip, there was some strange metal thing that spun him around and threw him off again. As Sean sat looking at the tube and trying to figure it out, he noticed the human standing at its window looking out and smiling. "It's strange they don't want me to get to the food," he thought to himself. "But why fill it with so many good things in the first place, then?" Then he noticed a smaller human standing next to the first and pointing at Sean. He realised he had lingered too long and ran back to the fence, looking around for some other source of food and wondering if he could find anything to eat at all. He went back to his nest and gnawed at the soft side of some tree bark and some moss he'd scavenged. It wouldn't help much, but at least it was something. The following day, he went back to the fence and sat there hungrily, trying to think what he could possibly do. He was back to square one and desperately needed to find a source of food. Then he noticed the small human again. It came out of the house with something in its hand. The big human came out after the small one and lifted it up high. The small one then tied something to the branch of a tree, and then they both went back into the house and watched. Sean was slightly confused, concerned, but most of all hungry. Eventually, curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to investigate, climbing up the tree and out to where the human had been. When he got there, he discovered a slice of apple hanging from the branch. He took a bite. It tasted rather good, and so he had another, and soon he'd eaten the whole thing, with a little stored in his cheeks for later. He didn't want to wait around too long in case this was some sort of trap, and so scampered off again. He still needed to scavenge up a little more food, and managed to find a tasty mushroom and a couple of discarded seeds. But that apple slice was the help he needed to get through the day. The next day he went back again, but this time there was no small human to see. There was, however, another slice of apple, though this time in a slightly different place, and a bit trickier to get to, requiring a mighty leap to reach. Again, he ate it gratefully before going back to scavenging a little more to fill his belly. And so the weeks went on. Sometimes the human would sit and watch Sean as he tracked down the daily slice of fruit. Sometimes he didn't see them, and sometimes there was no fruit to be found. It was never enough to completely fill him up anyway, but the extra food they gave him was just what he needed to get through that winter. And before he knew it, spring had arrived. There were plenty of tasty flowers to eat. The humans stopped leaving fruit out for Sean, but he didn't mind. He was just thankful they'd helped him in his time of need. And the following winter, with no more trees being cut down, he managed to store plenty of seeds and nuts to look after himself. The end.
Well, there we go. A story about Sean, who, through no fault of his own, found himself in a bit of trouble and needed help from someone else. And actually, maybe there's someone you can help this winter too. But time slips past quickly, and ours is almost done, though we're not quite there yet. There's still one more important thing to do, and that's the reading of my favourite poem for this time of year. It's called A Visit from St. Nicholas.
'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads, and Mamma in her kerchief, and I in my cap, had just settled our brains for a long winter's nap. When out on the lawn there arose such a clatter, I sprang from the bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters and threw up the sash. The moon on the breast of the new-fallen snow gave the lustre of midday to objects below, when what to my wandering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer, with a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment it must be St. Nick. More rapid than eagles his coursers they came, and he whistled and shouted and called them by name. Now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Donner and Blitzen. To the top of the porch, to the top of the wall, now dash away, dash away, dash away all. As dry leaves that before the wild hurricane fly when they meet with an obstacle mount to the sky, so up to the housetop the coursers they flew, with a sleigh full of toys and St. Nicholas too. And then in a twinkling I heard on the roof the prancing and pawing of each little hoof. As I drew in my head and was turning around, down the chimney St. Nicholas came with a bound. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. His eyes, how they twinkled, his dimples how merry, His cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard of his chin was as white as the snow. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke it encircled his head like a wreath. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him, in spite of myself. A wink of his eye and a twist of his head soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. He spoke not a word, but went straight to his work, and filled all the stockings, then turned with a jerk, and laying his finger aside of his nose, and giving a nod, up the chimney he rose. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team gave a whistle, and away they all flew like the down of a thistle. But I heard him exclaim, ere he drove out of sight, "Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night."
Well, unfortunately, my friends, that's all. Our time is up and the bed does call. Oh, wait a moment, that's strange. Sorry, seems that after reading that poem it made me keep rhyming. Seems to have passed for now, though. Anyway, I'm pretty much out of hot chocolate, and, well, it stopped being hot a while ago. I am feeling rather tired, though, and I am just about ready for bed. So there's just time for me to wish you all a good and peaceful night. And for tomorrow, if that's when you're celebrating, have a happy Christmas. Good night.